talk. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Our speaker is Dr. Veronica Yurchak from University of Maryland Extension, and she is our new commercial vegetable specialist. And this morning, she's going to talk about controlling thrips and whiteflies in greenhouse and high tunnel productions. So I think Hayden and I will both turn off our cameras, and Veronica, you can take it away.
All right, thank you, Emily. Yep, so I don't really need to give any more of an introduction, so I'll just get started. And before let me see, how do I advance? Here we go. Before I get started specifically talking about thrips and whiteflies in greenhouses and high tunnels, because this is the first presentation in this webinar series, I figured it would make sense to take a minute and just kind of briefly go over what IPM or integrated pest management is and kind of what the goals of it is, or goals are. So IPM is an ecosystem-based strategy. So it focuses on long-term pest prevention through a combination of both chemical and different non-chemical pest management techniques. And to do this, oh, sorry, my lights turn off in my office. But it requires a thorough understanding of the pest and kind of how it interacts with its environment. Because the goal is to then use this knowledge to modify our production practices to create an environment that makes pest survival more difficult. So going through the different kind of categories of control within IPM, cultural controls are methods of pest control that essentially make the site less attractive. So this could include managing alternate host plants. So that's usually means managing weeds, different crops that you put into a rotation to try to cut down on a pest life cycle, intercropping and trap cropping, which is more applicable to field production, but still fits within this cultural control options. And then altering planting time. So this might mean planting later to avoid a particular damaging stage within a certain pest life cycle or something like that. Physical control options. So this is anything you do that involves manually killing, removing, or excluding pests to prevent damage. So on smaller scales, this might mean physically removing the pest. This includes exclusion barriers, canopy manipulation, and trapping. And then biological pest control is the use of either insect natural enemies or entomopathogens, which are bacteria, viruses, or fungi that all attack and kill different insect pests. So using these to reduce pest populations. And then chemical control, of course, is the use of synthetic and organic insecticides for eliminating or controlling different pest populations. So in high tunnels and greenhouses, there are certain pests that tend to become more of a problem than they usually are in field situations. Not to say that they aren't ever a problem in the field, but things like whiteflies and thrips, also aphids and spider mites, all are very predictably going to be a problem in high tunnels and greenhouses. And part of this is due to the sort of microenvironment differences in these enclosed systems compared to field settings. And these environment differences make it more likely for these certain pests to survive. So one of those environmental conditions that's different in greenhouses and high tunnels that promotes these pests is this passive ventilation. So basically the restricted air movement in high tunnels and greenhouses creates pockets of higher temperatures and higher humidity inside the crop canopy. And these certain insect pests really like that very humid, very hot conditions. And this increases their development rates and helps them build populations faster. Also, the exclusion of rainfall. So in a field setting, for a lot of these, what we consider greenhouse and high tunnel pests, rainfall helps to wash the pests from the plants because they're usually very tiny insects. If you think about what a whitefly or a thrips or aphid look like, they're very small. And so a lot of these downpour kind of rainfall events that we get can help wash the pests from the plants. And so in greenhouses and high tunnels, that doesn't happen since we typically don't use overhead irrigation in these settings. So we have higher pest populations that can remain on the plants. And then also these entomopathogenic fungi that are naturally occurring in the environment and helping to control certain insects are, they like wet environments. So they tend to do better when we have a wetter crop canopy, as you might be more likely to find in the field. And then finally, the higher planting densities that we usually use in these greenhouse and high tunnel settings to increase production within a limited space can reduce insecticide coverage, making pest outbreaks more likely, and then also allow for easier pest migration through plantings. So things like spider mites, which move by crawling along the plant, are going to be more able to spread throughout that entire planting when that plant density is higher and those plants are all touching one another. So just keeping those things in mind, I'm going to talk about two specific pests to greenhouses and high tunnels today. So the first is whiteflies. And the way that I'm going to go through this is just take some time to go through pest ID and kind of life cycle information for whiteflies and then thrips. Talk a little bit about some preventative tactics and scouting tips, and then talk about biological control, and then briefly some information about chemical control for these different pests. So whiteflies are true bugs, which means they're in the order Hemiptera. And so that means they're actually, despite their name, they're a lot more closely related to things like aphids, leafhoppers, and even stink bugs than they are to flies. And much like aphids, they use their piercing, sucking mouth parts to kind of poke into the plant and then feed on plant sap. And in kind of the Northeast area, we typically deal with two different kinds of whiteflies. So there's the sweet potato whitefly, which you see in the picture on the left, and then the greenhouse whitefly, which is on the right. And they look very similar, but there's one way that you can often tell them apart, and that's by looking at how they hold their wings. So the sweet potato whitefly is usually going to hold its wings in sort of a more tented position. So its wings will be up higher, and there's often a visible gap between the wings that you can see. So you can see that in the picture here. And then the greenhouse whitefly tends to hold its wings flatter, and there's usually not that visible gap between the two wings there in the middle. And it is important for controlling these to know which whitefly you're dealing with in a lot of cases. So for the sweet potato whitefly, which is also sometimes called the silverleaf whitefly, there are actually two different biotypes that exist within this species. And so a biotype is basically a group within the species that looks similar. So visually you can't tell them apart at all, but they differ in their response to control measures. So for these biotypes, you can't tell them apart by looking at them, but they differ in their susceptibility to insecticides. So depending on which biotype you're dealing with, some products may be more or less effective, which is sometimes why a product that worked for one grower might not work nearly as well for somebody else, even if they're very close geographically. So a lot of times whitefly infestations originate from infested plant materials that were purchased somewhere else and brought into the greenhouse or the high tunnel. And in that case, they could be from two different growers, could be bringing in source material from two different places and maybe producing very close to one another. The high tunnels are located nearby, but that pest source was very different. And so the Q biotype is the one that has shown insecticide resistance to a lot of our common greenhouse insecticides. So things like imidacloprid, thimethoxam, acetamiprid, and a handful of insect growth regulator products all don't work very well on the Q biotype. Both of them are transmitters of leaf curl virus in tomatoes, and they have a very broad host range. The greenhouse whitefly has very similar habits. It causes very similar damage to the sweet potato whitefly. It also has a very broad host range, but it's generally a little easier to control with different common insecticides. Both whitefly types, the sweet potato and the greenhouse whitefly, are typically found on the undersides of the leaves. Particularly the eggs, the nymphs, and the pupa stages are all found on the underside of the leaves. Feeding can cause the leaves to kind of yellow and curl. And then, like aphids, whiteflies produce honeydew. And so you can, when you have higher pest outbreaks, higher populations, you can get this kind of shiny appearance to the leaf, like you see in the photo in the center. And then that can cause sooty mold, as is shown in the photo on the right. So those are all signs. Hopefully you catch an infestation way before it looks like this, but this is what a very heavy infestation looks like. Just to quickly go through the life cycle, so the adults are very tiny. The eggs they lay are even tinier. I mentioned they lay eggs on the underside of the leaves. Typically on the newest plant leaves is where they'll lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch, and then the first instars, so the really early stages right after they hatch, are called crawlers. They will move a short distance onto nearby plants or across to different parts of the plant, and then those later instars settle down and feed and actually lose the ability to walk. So after that point, they'll settle down and stay in that same location for the rest of their nymph instars and then pupate in that spot. And then the adult whiteflies will emerge from that pupa and then fly off to infest other plant material. We used to say that whiteflies didn't overwinter in Maryland, but with kind of on average warmer winters combined with increased production of leafy greens and other fall vegetables, into the fall and winter in high tunnels and under plastic covers, they really are overwintering quite well in our area. So we don't really say that anymore. When it comes to greenhouse and high tunnel pests, whiteflies and any other pests, prevention is probably going to be the most important thing that you can do to cut down on infestation and damage throughout the season. So one of the most important things for whiteflies that you can do is to make sure to inspect and then isolate any plant material that you're bringing into the high tunnel in the greenhouse. So this could be plants and transplants that you've purchased or cuttings that you might be bringing in from outside. But oftentimes whitefly outbreaks can be traced back to infested material that was brought into that greenhouse or that high tunnel. But the eggs and the nymphs especially are really, really tiny and really difficult to see. So they can be very easy to miss even if you are inspecting that plant material. So if you can isolate the plant material that you're bringing in, either in a separate bay, that would be best, or even just in a separate area of the greenhouse for 1 to 2 weeks. This just allows any nymphs that might be on the plant to get a little bit bigger, make them easier for you to see, and then control before they turn into adults and start causing real problems inside that greenhouse. Also, cleaning the greenhouse of plant debris at the end of the season. So whiteflies can continue to feed and develop on dead plants or dying post-season crops that you might have in there. So getting all of that out of the greenhouse or the high tunnel is important. And then also managing weeds. So a lot of weeds are hosts for whiteflies. And so in the off season, they can provide a spot that those whiteflies can continue to survive, even when you're not actively growing anything in there. I have seen recommendations online that I came across to treat vegetation surrounding the outside of the greenhouse with horticultural oil. I kind of disagree with that because, in my opinion, if you're going to take the time to manage the vegetation outside your greenhouse or your high tunnel, it makes a lot more sense to put the effort into just removing that vegetation that might be within a foot or a couple feet of that greenhouse or high tunnel. That way, if you aren't able to continue to actively manage those pests on those plants, the plant's not there to provide a source for those pests to then move into the greenhouse. So I threw it up on the screen just because I did come across that recommendation, but it would be a lot better to just remove those weeds or that plant material immediately surrounding the outside of the greenhouse or the high tunnel. Scouting. So scouting for adults is very easy. They readily fly when the plants are disturbed. So if you just kind of walk through and run your hand along those plants, it'll disturb those adults and they'll start flying and you'll be able to easily see them. So you can do that either in your own greenhouse or high tunnel, or if you are looking in a nursery or somewhere to bring plants in, you could do that there too, just to make sure you don't see any whiteflies as an indicator that you might then bring in that pest to your system. Yellow sticky traps are a common tool for monitoring for whitefly adults. So when you use this, you want to suspend them just above the plant canopy. This can help to detect changes in populations. So when you're using the sticky cards, you want to inspect them and once a week change out the card and then record any whiteflies that you captured. And then over time, this can help you see if that population is increasing or staying the same. Also, putting sticky cards near the entrance or the exit to the greenhouse or near any areas where you have ventilation set up can help detect whiteflies that might be coming in from the outside environment into that greenhouse. They will catch adults and can be used to suppress the population of whiteflies to some extent. They probably aren't going to be enough, even if you have a lot of sticky traps in that greenhouse, to fully manage the whiteflies. But if you have a lot of them, they can be used to help suppress that population. Inspecting for the eggs, the nymphs, and the pupae is a really good thing to do, but it's very difficult. They're very tiny and hard to see. You need a magnifying glass or a hand lens or something to be able to spot them, and even then they're very easy to miss. But just especially keeping an eye out for the adults and using those sticky traps to monitor can be very helpful. As far as cultural controls, if you have a whitefly outbreak and you are able to implement a host-free period after that crop has ended, this can be a very effective way to eliminate whiteflies in the greenhouse. Unfortunately, there are very few plants that are not a host to whiteflies. So marigolds, a few types of herbs I've seen are among the short list of plants that whiteflies will not infest. So probably more likely this would involve just having a completely empty greenhouse for a period of time. So if it's empty for a few weeks, whiteflies are not a pest that are going to kind of hide out in the soil or wait out a long time for another host plant to come in there. So a few weeks, if you can, after an infestation is typically enough to get rid of any whitefly populations. But like in this photo here, you can see you would have to get rid of all of those weeds along the perimeter of the greenhouse, in addition to not having any plants or crops in there in order to fully eliminate those whiteflies. There are a few commercially available biological control agents that you can buy to manage whiteflies. So there are 3 types of parasitoid wasps and then an entomopathogenic fungus. And I'll go through very briefly each one of these. So unfortunately, there's no common names for these biocontrol organisms. So we just have to use a scientific name. But Encarissa formosa is a parasitoid wasp that can be purchased. It's mostly effective against the greenhouse whitefly, So that's why, and this is another situation why it's important to know which type of whitefly you're dealing with. And if you do look into buying this biocontrol agent and releasing it in your greenhouse, you might notice that some companies recommend higher release rates if you're trying to control whiteflies in tomatoes. And that's because tomatoes specifically are covered in trichomes, or these dense kind of plant hairs on the stems and on the leaves as well. And this is a form of plant defense, but it also makes it harder for the parasitoid to find the whitefly nymphs, which is the stage that it targets. So to compensate for this, some companies recommend releasing the parasitoid in higher numbers. But you want to use this when whiteflies are first detected. So with all biocontrol agents, they work a lot better as a preventative tactic. They're not going to take down an existing outbreak and get it under control. So either when you first detect the whiteflies, or if you are dealing with an outbreak, you can use some type of insecticide to knock down that population, wait till that residue period has worn off, and then release these to maintain lower pest pressure. But when you do purchase them, they arrive as pupae that are glued to paper cards. So you want to suspend these paper cards down in the lower portion of the canopy. And that's just to keep them out of direct sunlight and help prevent them from drying out before they have a chance to emerge. And also make sure to take down any sticky cards for a few days following their release. That just helps to prevent recapturing the wasps you just purchased on those sticky cards before they're able to parasitize any whiteflies that might be out there. Another species, which Eretmoceras eremicus, is another species of parasitoid wasp. So just like the previous one, these are wasps that will lay their eggs inside the whitefly nymphs, and then when those nymphs pupate, the adult flies emerge or the adult parasitoids emerge rather than the whiteflies. This species attacks both greenhouse and sweet potato whiteflies, and it is a lot more tolerant of insecticides. So I meant to mention, if we go back, this Encarissa formosa is very, very susceptible to insecticides, to the point where dried residues of a lot of our common greenhouse insecticides will be enough to kill these wasps if they're then released. The E. eremicus is a lot more tolerant of a lot of our greenhouse insecticides, so it's a better option if you're trying to pair both chemical and biological control. And this is shipped a couple different ways, also as pupae or loosely in sawdust. So just talk with the supplier about what fits best for your operation. E. mundus is the last species of parasitoid wasp that you can purchase and release for controlling whiteflies. This one will only parasitize sweet potato whiteflies, particularly that B biotype. It's a newer parasitoid, so it's compared to the others, it hasn't been available commercially for as long. It will be active under a wider range of temperatures. So you have to keep in mind when you're looking at these different parasitoids to purchase online that because they are living organisms, they have certain environmental conditions that they're going to work best under. So some work better in cooler temperatures, some in warmer temperatures. All of that information is always available through the suppliers online. And this one also comes in a couple different types of packaging. So just talk with the supplier about what works best for you. Boravia bassiana is a entomopathogenic fungus that you can purchase. It's put out as a spray, and it causes white muscadine disease in a number of different soft-bodied insects. So this one will it'll get thrips, it'll get aphids, it'll get whiteflies. It causes contact infection, which is nice because a lot of bacteria and viruses have to actually be consumed by the pest you're trying to target. This just has to come into contact with the outside of the body of that pest, and then the infection starts to take hold, and it will actually continue to develop and spread even after the insect has been killed. So it can sort of sustain in that greenhouse or in that high tunnel for a longer period of time. For a lot of our greenhouse pests, just like with insecticides, you would want to make sure to try to get this sprayed on the underside of the leaves, since that's where a lot of these pests like to hang out. That'll result in the best contact with the pest and also increase the amount of time that it is effective for, because this fungus will start to die in direct sunlight. So when you spray it on the underside of the leaf, it'll last longer, and continue to infect those insects for longer. Again, the rate at which the pests are killed is going to depend on temperature. Just like with the pest, the fungus is going to grow faster in warmer temperatures. So it may not work as quickly very early in the season or very late in the season when we have colder nights and just cooler greenhouse temperatures. For chemical control, I'm not going to talk specifically about specific products or what you can spray, but if you go to the Mid-Atlantic Commercial Vegetable Production Recommendations Guide, so this is available for free online if you just search the title, and in, I think, the second chapter, so you don't want to look up individually by crop, but early in one of the earlier chapters, there's table E7. This gives you a table of insecticides and miticides that are labeled for greenhouse use. It'll give you the product name, the active ingredient, what pests that product works on, what crops it's labeled for, how long before you can harvest after you spray it, and then how long before you can re-enter that crop. And then also includes just some efficacy and use comments that are relevant to that product. So a lot of really good information in that table. So go there for specific spray recommendations. I will say that translaminar and systemic insecticides, so those products that after they're sprayed onto the plant will absorb them and sort of move that material around throughout the plant, are probably going to be more effective. You don't have to be as vigilant about making sure you get that product sprayed on the underside of the leaf. As long as it gets on the plant, it'll get to where it needs to be to control that pest. For combined tactics where you're trying to use chemical and biological control at the same time, the insect growth regulators may be preferable, especially early in the cropping cycle, because they're going to impact those parasitoids less. And so you could potentially be able to build up that parasitoid population while still managing your pests a little bit more effectively. For organic chemical control, for heavy infestations, insecticidal soaps can be sprayed. You have to make sure to get these on the underside of the leaf, so these are not going to move throughout the plant the way some of the other systemic products will. And you want to avoid spraying the soaps in very hot weather or onto overly stressed plants. This can be detrimental to the plant. Horticultural oils and neem products are also going to work well for the nymphs and the eggs and the pupa stages. Pyrethrins are going to be the most effective against the adults. The eggs and pupae specifically, also I should mention, they tolerate a lot of insecticides except for the horticultural oils. The oils kind of smother the pest, and they'll be effective against all life stages that they're able to come into contact with, provided there's good coverage. So moving on to thrips, I'm again going to go through pest ID and life cycle a little bit, some tactics for preventing and scouting, and then biological and chemical controls. So in sort of the mid-Atlantic, we have a number of different thrip species. So we have the eastern and western flower thrips, tobacco thrips, onion thrips, which I didn't put on this list, and then also chili thrips, which are not that common, but they spread very quickly. They're more common right now in Florida, Texas, far south states, But when we do have them, they're very difficult to control. They're resistant to a lot of insecticides. So I just wanted to put that one up there. Also, under optimal temperature and environmental conditions, the thrips life cycle can be as short as 2 weeks. So they can build up a population inside a greenhouse or a high tunnel very, very quickly. The females lay their eggs pretty much anywhere on the plant, any of the above ground portions of the plant. And while they do cause direct feeding damage on the plants, a lot of times we're more concerned with the viruses that thrips vector, particularly tomato spotted wilt virus is a big one. But here you can see some of the photos of just direct feeding damage on a tomato plant. And then they overwinter on annual weeds. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we're talking about preventative tactics. But these are just some more pictures of thrips damage. So you see you get kind of like a silvery white scars on the leaves where they're feeding. And then you'll typically also see a lot of these black fecal spots within the areas where you have damage. And that's oftentimes when you see that, that's going to be thrips damage. So for scouting, if you're looking for thrips directly on the plants, they're really difficult to see. So you can take a white piece of paper, hold it under that plant or under the flower, and kind of tap on the plant or on the blossom so that the thrips fall out of that flower onto the paper, and then use a hand lens or a magnifying glass to look at the insects that fall out. So that just makes it a little bit easier to see what's there. You can use either yellow or blue sticky traps to detect the adults. So this is the easiest way to detect an infestation since they're so difficult to see. Blue sticky cards have been found to be better for attracting and monitoring adult thrips. But yellow sticky cards are better if you're also using them to monitor for other pests. So if you're looking just to monitor whiteflies, winged aphids, fungus gnats, thrips, you want to go with the yellow ones. If you are just interested in thrips, the blue ones are probably going to catch more of them. Again, you want to check them, count any pests, any thrips on the cards weekly, and record the population so that you can see any increases that might be happening over time, and then replace those sticky cards each week. Again, prevention is going to be really important, and probably the best thing that you can do to prevent early season thrips is to manage the weeds in and around your greenhouse. So thrips are known to overwinter on weeds, winter annual weeds, and some previous sampling in Maryland has found that thrips will actually be present on weeds in higher numbers surrounding greenhouses and high tunnels than if you go further out into a nearby field. So managing those weeds, getting rid of them so the thrips aren't able to overwinter really inside or nearby those high tunnels can really help cut down on early season infestations. When you can, don't keep ornamentals and vegetables in the greenhouse together, particularly if you're bringing in material from other places. Ornamentals tend to harbor a lot of thrips that can then move into the vegetables that you're trying to grow. In certain greenhouse settings, coarse gravel on top of plastic creates an unfavorable habitat for the thrips pupa. So the pupa stage is in the soil. So if you can restrict the pest access to the soil, that can cut down on the overall pressure that you have throughout the season. And also in exclusion netting or mesh on ventilation areas can be a good way to keep them out as well. As far as biocontrols, there are 3 different commercially available biocontrol agents that are recommended for managing thrips. 2 of them are predatory mites, and then 1 is just a generalist insect predator. And so the first, this A. Swierski, this is a predatory mite. It attacks a diversity of small soft-bodied pests. So it will feed on thrips. It will also feed on aphids, any any small soft-bodied pest that it comes across, it will try to feed on. Um, they are highly mobile, so they disperse by walking, which means they're going to be more effective later in the season when those crops are bigger and the canopy is touching. If you try to put these mites out right after you transplant and you have a lot of space between every plant, they're going to have a harder time spreading throughout that greenhouse. Um, that being said, the adults will not move far unless prey is scarce or shelter is limited, meaning that if you release them in a high tunnel where the sides are open and there's a lot more interaction with the outside environment, unlike some organisms which might just fly away out into the field and be gone, they will stay on the crop that you release them on, provided there is a source of prey on that crop. Um, they only attack egg and larval stage thrips, so they're better used for prevention. They won't take down an existing outbreak. And then they consume about 10 thrips larvae per day. And cucumerus, so this is another species of predatory mite, controls thrips as well as a number of mites that we have to deal with. So spider mites, cyclamen mites, and broad mites. They are predatory in both the immature and adult stages, but they will only attack immature thrips. So both species of predatory mites will only feed on immature stage thrips. They won't feed on the adults. Establishment can take 3 to 4 weeks. So again, they're better used as a preventative tactic. But this mite will feed on pollen as a food source. So that means that you can release it before you actually have any pests present, as long as you have some type of flowering plant inside that greenhouse or high tunnel, and they'll just kind of hang out until a pest outbreak starts, and then they'll switch and start feeding on those thrips or those spider mites or whatever pest is in there. You can use them alone or with other non-mite biocontrol organisms, but you wouldn't want to pair this one with the previous mite that I just talked about. So because they do feed on mites, they'll feed on other biocontrol mites as well. So just for getting the most, I guess, bang for your buck, you don't want to pair these with other predatory mite biocontrols. The minute pirate bug, so this is a generalist predator. It's extremely common in field settings. If you go in a sweet corn field in the summer when it's silking, you could find tons of these. But it is the only commercially available biocontrol agent capable of attacking adult thrips. So no matter how good of a job you're doing managing the pests inside that greenhouse, inevitably there are probably going to be some adults that manage to work their way in when you open the door or something like that. So having some of these around inside the greenhouse can be a really good way to just have something in there that's able to attack those adults before they start reproducing. And they can also survive on pollen and nectar when prey is scarce. Again, because these are living organisms, they're going to work better under certain temperature conditions. So here I just showed the kind of optimum humidity and temperatures for these different organisms. Some might be better earlier in the season, some might be better later. It just depends on what the conditions in your greenhouse or high tunnel are like. Again, for chemical controls, I would refer you back to this table E7 in the recommendations guide. So this will give you all the information that you need. And then I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit more. So most of the biological control tactics, with the exception of a few that I talked about, may be better suited to greenhouses where you have kind of a closed system. So the natural enemies that you release are going to be less able to just kind of fly off into the environment and be gone. This type of control is augmentative biocontrol. So when you purchase commercially available biocontrols and release them, that's augmentative biocontrol. Conservation biocontrol is the idea of, what you can do to manipulate your cropping system to increase the abundance of naturally occurring beneficial organisms, so those predators and parasitoids that naturally exist in the field, what can you do to increase their abundance and bring them into, in this case, your high tunnel system? So because high tunnels typically are a lot more open to the environment, there is the potential to do some of these tactics to bring in those natural enemies. So in a field setting, we usually do intercropping or adding flowers to increase these natural enemies, try to provide a source of pollen and nectar, since a lot of them will also feed on pollen and nectar. There isn't a lot of research yet on using these strategies in high tunnels. But if it's something you're interested in trying, what you want to keep in mind is sort of the basic requirements that insects need to survive, or that these natural enemies need. So they need a food source. So if you don't have a pest outbreak, that means they need an alternative food source, which is typically pollen and nectar. So that's oftentimes why we add things like marigolds or sweet alyssum or other flowering plants to try to bring in those natural enemies. They also need shelter and proper climate. So that might mean areas that they can escape direct sunlight or escape predation by other natural enemies, which is generally why a more diverse habitat will support more of these beneficial insects. And then along those same lines, they need reproduction sites. So overall, if you're going to try to go the companion planting route in a high tunnel, to try to bring in those natural enemies from the field, you want to try to use your knowledge of the pests, or of the pests and the natural enemies, to try to make that environment more conducive to survival of the natural enemy and harder for survival of the pest. So if anyone has done this in a high tunnel with any level of success, I would love to hear about it. Again, like I said, there's not a whole lot of research looking into this yet, but there is some that's starting to look at what you can do in a high tunnel to use this biocontrol more effectively. But please reach out if you have any questions about anything I said, or if you've tried some of this companion planting in a high tunnel with success. I'd love to hear about it. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or here's my contact information.
Well, thank you, Veronica, very much. If you have any questions, now is the time to ask. I'm going to drop a Google form into the chat that is for pesticide recertification. So if you need your pesticide recertification for Maryland or Delaware, if you could please fill out that Google form.